So before we get started, I just wanted to recommend you to go to this site. If you have any wishes, if you have any feedback on Azure Stack, this is a great place to do so. So there's going to be 3 of us presenting this session. So my name is Christer Olsson. I'm the technical sales lead for Azure Stack in EMEA. So I've been working on this with customers the last year. Today we will talk a bit about how to do a proper evaluation, how to look at Azure Stack and position it internally. And also we will get some real-life experience from an early adopter here.
Yeah, my name is Alexander Otter. I'm an Azure Stack TSP now in Germany. So I will join the group from Christer, and I did a lot of POCs and workshops with customers and work with them to understand what's the requirements about Azure Stack, what they want to do with Azure Stack, and how can they do a POC with Azure Stack, and that will be my part here in this session. And then I will introduce. No?
Yeah, I'm Carsten Rachfal. Hello, I'm from Germany. I'm not a Microsoft employee, but I work very closely with these guys. And we were so fortunate to help Microsoft validating the Azure Stack from early 2017 on. And I'm a Microsoft MVP for Cloud and Data Center Management. And the RD is for Regional Director. So I'm not a Microsoft employee, but I'm a Microsoft Regional Director.
Okay, great. So the things that we will cover this session. So I will first start a bit high level, talking again about what Azure Stack is and what it isn't. It is really important to understand that. I will talk a bit about how to set up an evaluation. So we've done this for a number of customers now, and you can do it either the long way, or you can save some time in doing that by including more steps from scratch. So I will spend about the first part of that, and then I will hand over to Alexander to go deeper and talk really about hands-on how we can do the testing here. So I'm pretty sure you've all seen this slide before, but I think it's a good one to bring up anyway. So we see a lot of conflicts out at customers currently. So we see the business, they really demand new capabilities, new feature in order to be competitive. And of course, IT, they want to deliver that. But at the same time, they need to take care of their existing environments. They need to save money and all these things. So that leads to that the business often goes off and purchase their own systems. And that's shadow IT. So we do think that we have a way to fix this, and that's the cloud transformation. And that's really about the cloud model. It's not the place. So Azure Stack, it's all about delivering Azure services from your own data center. It's not, there have been so many misconceptions out there on what Azure Stack can and cannot do. But it is all about delivering Azure services from your own data center. And this is something that we are unique in that we can do. The consistency we have with Azure Stack, an on-prem solution with a hyperscale public cloud, is really something that we only can do. And if you have it within the limits of Azure Stack when it comes to services and scale, it is really the same thing. It is the same APIs. You can just take an application from one side and run on the others. And that's one of the key, or that's probably the key benefits with it. If you've been to other Azure Stack sessions, you've seen this slide before. And I'm mentioning it here because it is important to find the right use case from start. So my recommendation is when you evaluate Azure Stack, you don't start with it from a generic perspective. It is, with the current capabilities, these are the best use cases that we can have for Azure Stack. For example, edge and disconnected solution. Let's say that you have a factory. You have to have super low latency. You cannot rely on the internet connectivity. That's a good use case. Cloud applications to meet varied regulations can, for example, be in the finance business. So we're working quite a bit with finance customers on this. Another one can be, I'm working, for example, with a gaming company. They're born in the cloud, they do everything in Azure, but now when they expand, they are not allowed to run things in the public Azure in some countries. So in that case, they're going to take their application as is and run it on Azure Stack and deliver services locally. The last one, cloud application model on premises, can, for example, be a government customer that have legacy systems, mainframes, or what have you. They want to modernize. They want to get to the higher level services, the PaaS services, and they see cloud as a way to do so, but they can't use the public cloud. So, and the thing is, by mentioning this, is that it's probably the first discussion you should have, because this also have an implication on the business case and how you design and order the system as well. So, as I mentioned, I've been working on this and also on the predecessor cloud platform system for a number of years now, and we learned a few things. So the best way to set up an evaluation of a hybrid cloud system is, at least according to me, the following. So the first thing would be to establish a shared vision of what you want to do with the product. When you have that, between the organization that's evaluating, as well as Microsoft or the partner, and you also have an executive sponsor aligned to this project. That's the first step. Then you need to have representatives from both the business side, development, and IT at the same time. The big source of delay is when you, for example, only include representatives from IT when you evaluate Azure Stack. And the things I'm mentioning here is mainly about ensuring a common understanding and to avoid delays. For example, by including all of these resources at the same time, when you encounter a blocker or a risk or something like that, then you will have to support to either go ahead with the evaluation or not to. So there are a number of key conversations that you need to have when evaluating. So it is about the business case and use scenarios, and as I mentioned, that has the use case has an implication on the cost in the business case. You also need to have a conversation about the infrastructure fit. Will it really work in here? The same is true for the application. You need to work with the hardware partner. It's not only something that you can have a discussion with Microsoft on. And last, you need to have an approval to go ahead with this from a security and compliance perspective. So my recommendation here is that you sign name contacts, both on the customer side as well as on the partner side or on Microsoft side, to go ahead with this. So a business case can involve a number of things. I'm mainly going to focus on the cost of the system here. So it is the responsibility of the hardware partner to do the sizing of the system. So you will work together with Microsoft first, but also with the hardware partner to do the sizing of the system. And in order to do sizing, you need to know what you're going to use it for. So you need to have the use case. So that's why you need to have that from start. That's really important. And you buy, of course, the hardware directly from the hardware partner. It includes support and installation services. Then you need to have the Azure services, and you can buy them pay-as-you-go or in the capacity model. And then, of course, you need a support contract, both with Microsoft and the hardware partner. And speaking of hardware partners, we have 4 that are currently accepting orders and 2 on the way. So currently it's Dell EMC, it's HP, Lenovo they're shipping, and Cisco are taking orders as well here. And I recommend you to start working with the hardware partners as soon as possible. Of course, because of what I said earlier with regards to the use case and cost and so on, but they also have a number of resources that can help you with the evaluation, and not only the hardware itself, but in many cases also other services, etc. Security, privacy, and compliance. Often this is left until the end, as far as I see. So I've seen several projects where we've done a whole bunch of work, invested money on both from the customer side as well as on the Microsoft side, and then these questions come up a bit later on, causing a delay. Most often it's not a big issue because we can work through all of these things, but I recommend really to start in parallel with this discussion. And when you look at security and compliance for Azure Stack, we cannot fulfill all regulations just with Azure Stack. It's just one part of the solution. Then you have policies and people, etc., that you own. What we can do is that we can provide the control sets to help you be compliant with your regulations. And if you're talking about the hybrid solution and you haven't worked with Azure before, then you also need to take a look at our certifications, etc., for public Azure. And we have a whole number of certifications there, and also a lot of resources on the Azure Trust Portal. So one thing, so Azure Stack is new. That's something to have in mind. And when it comes to the infrastructure and application fit, it's not the only conversation you need to have. So I've seen way too many projects where we only focus on infrastructure and application. We need to have the other ones as well, otherwise there are just going to be delays, and it's not going to be as efficient as possible. With that said, so Azure Stack is new. Don't project the past onto it. It is about the cloud model. You really need to manage and handle things as a part of the cloud model. You manage it through ARM, etc. And you can't, in many cases, you can't do things the way that you used to do before. So I think that's it. So those are the steps I recommend that you do. You can do it either together with Microsoft or together with a partner, and choose whatever you want from the list. But I think it's a good list. And now Alexander will show you how more in detail to go when it comes to the infrastructure and application fit conversation.
Thank you, Krista, for the business view of the things here. Now I would like to go a little bit deeper about a possible POC or what you should consider about a POC from the organization side, but also from the technical side. So that means we start. How can you do a POC? How can you fulfill it? What should you consider, and where can you do this? Okay, we have a few options where you can start for Azure Stack. The easy start, as you know, Azure Stack is the same as Azure, is always Azure. So we have the ability to go into Azure to start your own VMs, start your own services in Azure, and also here are saying Azure Stack policy. So that means we have the ability to add a policy to a subscription or a resource group in Azure. And with that means, I will show it in a few minutes, with that you can control the environment in Azure, and it looks like an Azure Stack from the services perspective. But that is only a starting point. So the next thing is the most common option. It's called an Azure Stack Development Kit. May you try it out the technical previews for Azure Stack as a single node. May you had a look into some blogs, into tweets, into the documentation from Microsoft about Azure Stack. Then you will find very, very, very quick the term of the Azure Stack Development Kit, and that is a single node system that you can deploy on your own, in opposite to an appliance which comes from the hardware vendor. So the next thing here is, if you've done the first two parts, then you can start with an integration system, at least at that time. And additional, I repeat the topic from Christa, you should start very, very early the discussion with the hardware vendor. So who can support you and who can support you in this journey to an Azure Stack deployment? First of all, of course, Microsoft, so your account team, your local account team, MTC, so the Microsoft Technology Centers offers prepackaged workshops like architecture design sessions or DevOps session, especially for Azure Stack. So what should you consider to develop your own application for Azure Stack in terms of Azure and in terms of DevOps scenarios? And additionally, the Hardware Innovation Center. So we have a few ones from HPE, from Lenovo, Cisco built up ones in US, in Europe, and you can go to there and work with them. What should I consider if I want to put an Azure Stack appliance in my own data center? So there is a lot of questions around about networking, about security, compliance, what Christa mentioned, and so on and so on. And the important point here is for every POC, and the most of you knows that, but I want to repeat that. What are the proof points? So what would you want? What do you want to achieve with this POC, especially for Azure Stack? Especially if you take the adventure of an ASDK. And honestly, I did so many POCs in the last 18 months. It is for now an adventure. So if you take this route, then understand what do you want to test here, what do you want to prove. Look for the place where you want to do it. It is your own data center, it may be an MTC, it may be with a partner like Equinix or other partners where the hardware is there and you can test it for some days, weeks, maybe months. So take a look on that and looking for the right partner. So the partner should understood the cloud model. That is a very important point. Should understood how they can help you into the journey to Azure and Azure Stack, and especially from the infrastructure side, it is sometimes challenging to understand the changes between a traditional data center, between a traditional IT, and the new opportunities in Azure, in a cloud model, and especially with Azure Stack. So what are the requirements? Again, we start with Azure. I saw so many POCs. We are going there, we discuss Azure Stack, and the customer want to understand, hey, what's this Azure Stack? And I start, okay, you need a network. Okay, I call my Cisco guys, my network guys. Not really. Maybe you should have another approach. So if you start with Azure Stack, start with Azure always. So that means understand infrastructure as a service. So VMs, what can you do with VMs? VM extensions. How does this work in an automated fashion maybe? ARM templates and so on and so on. Networking, storage. So that are the basic stuff that we discovered that is really, really necessary to understand the basic things of Azure Stack. The more advantage things are now the platforms services, like app services, databases. So what kind of services are available, what's not, and how, and if there is a service available like Azure Functions, how can I enable my developers in your customers to do that? Additional DevOps scenarios. I say developers. That is a very, very important point here. Not just the infrastructure people, also the developers should be part of a POC. So talk with them. Let's try them in Azure to connect their own tools. Microsoft tools, open source tools, here are Jenkins, something. So what are the requirements for connecting a tool to Azure and even to Azure Stack? Because if a tool is able to connect to Azure, then it's able to connect also usually to Azure Stack. Identity. Don't forget identity. It's always, okay, I speak with IT guys, with infrastructure guys. Okay, Active Directory are doing the other guys. Other door, maybe. But here it's important to understand how can you integrate an Azure Active Directory. Do you want to use an Azure Active Directory or a traditional Active Directory with Azure Stack? So that means understand the requirements here. So especially in Azure. So as you see, we are not talking about Azure Stack at all, but starting in Azure to understand the techniques and the principles in Azure. That is very, very important. Okay, if you've done that, you are in a good way, but take the guys that is needed with you. So call the networking guys, and believe me or not, it is important to have them on board. I saw a lot of customers and a lot of POCs struggling because, oh, you really need an internet connectivity? Okay, maybe we should discuss it, and maybe we raise a ticket to a different department and come please 3 months later. Or other scenario, I had a small bank, and we took about 4 months to put a single server in their own data center. 4 months. So start very early to discuss this with the internal guys. That is needed for this POC. So that's other business guys, what Christa mentioned, and that helps a lot, but also the technical guys. So networking, firewall, security also. So what are the requirements for a single server, but also afterwards for an appliance? And of course, you see it again, your developers. So talk to them. Even they don't know Microsoft, but they will recognize that Microsoft also works in the open source area, that we have a lot of tools for them, though it works. And a very simple sentence at the end of the slide, but it's very important, because so many times I get the question, okay, I have here a data center, I have here a rack, and yeah, you can use our Active Directory for users. Okay, is that your productive active? Yeah, sure, but hey, you have a single server. No, it's not the point here. To do always a POC in an isolated environment. So it sounds weird. So most of you will do this usually, but it is an important point here to understand that Azure Stack, if you do it in a single node system with a Azure Stack development kit, please do it in an isolated way. Okay, that was the basics. A little bit more further. Azure Stack Policy Tool. So I mentioned a few minutes before that we have the ability to put a policy on Azure that Azure looks like as an Azure Stack. Okay, not the same. The portal is the same, but it's still say in the corner Microsoft Azure, not Microsoft Azure Stack. But you can put a policy on the subscription and or on an Azure resource group that this subscription or the resource group is only allowed to create or to use resource provider or resource types that's available within Azure Stack. That helps a lot to start, for example, for your developers, to start to thought about, okay, what can I use in Azure for Azure Stack? So to have a quick start here. So to do this a little bit faster, we provide on GitHub a tool. It's called Azure Stack Labs, and that's collected all necessary scripts, pre-configured ARM templates to do some tests, and so on, and you can use it directly. So, but what I want to do is to show it in action. That means we will go to my desktop, to my fancy desktop, and we start with PowerShell. Okay, I know so most of you understood PowerShell, but or maybe I don't know like me. So I'm a PowerShell copy developer, so I copy always everything from the website. And that's happened here. So I will start, I need to import the Azure Stack policy module. So that means I downloaded the Azure Stack tools already here. I imported the Azure Stack policy tool, so I need to log in to my Azure subscription here. I will do it in a few seconds. And then I start with a simple way, more simple way. It's so I will put a policy to a Azure Resource Group. Azure Resource Group. So let us take a view on Azure. So we have here our Azure portal, and you see here on the left-hand side the resource groups, and here are some more resource groups. Let us go here in, and I tried a little bit. So I have here one Azure Stack non-policy, and you can imagine that is a standard, not fancy resource group, and we don't have here a policy. And I will not do that, but you can imagine you can here install and create every service that is in Azure available. But the other thing here is, if I go back to the resource groups, I have here the Azure Stack Ignite 1, and now I will create an Azure Stack Ignite 2. So I will log in me, and for that, to put my password here in and log in. Now it should be working. And afterwards, so I create a new resource group here. In Central US, I get some IDs, and then I need to create a new Azure Resource Manager policy definition, with which name Azure Stack Policy, and it works. And now I need to assign this new policy to this resource group. So I will do that as well. So that runs, and as I learned in other sessions, always waiting for demos for running scripts, it took time. So hit the refresh button, and we have a new Azure Stack demo resource group, and we take a look on the policies, and now we have here the Azure Stack policy. So if I create a new service, I will start very fancy thing, Cosmos DB. Honestly, I don't exactly know what this is, but it works. SQL, very good. Use an existing, and Azure and Cosmos DB is not available today on Azure Stack. And if I click create, it says, hey, there's a policy that is not allowed to do that. So that means you are preventing to use resource group or resource types that are not available in Azure Stack today. So and we will adjust this policy file over time if we get new services on Azure Stack available. So that is the first one. Go back to the slides. If you've done this and you're successful, so you saw it's not really complicated. All pieces of the script was from the official website. Then we can start. Then we can go further to the Azure Stack Development Kit, and that is a little bit more complicated. But let us take a look what is it in detail. So. How many of you tried with the technical preview the single node version? Okay, maybe it's a half or a third, maybe. So what it is, we always say it, and maybe you get the very interesting information that Azure Stack is an integrated system. and it comes from a hardware vendor. We saw it, so we have today 6 hardware vendors announced, and you get it completely up and running, fulfilled in your data center. Very good. But sometimes it's necessary to test a little bit about that, to get familiar with the techniques. How can I this integrate it in my environment? How can I this integrate it with System Center, maybe, or with other fancy tools like Nagios or OMS or whatever? That requires that you are allowed to install Azure Stack by your own for a single node system. So that is an Azure Stack development kit. So you download a piece of software, install it on your own hardware, especially hardware. I know that Carsten did during the week 2 times a session about nested virtualization in Azure Stack, and that is also an option. But usually I would recommend to use a hardware for that. The next thing here is you put it on the hardware, start a PowerShell script. There's a fancy thing called install Azure Stack.ps1, and there are coming some options. So you need to put an password and maybe some other networking stuff in, and then it runs about 5 hours. And after that, you have an up and running Azure Stack on one single box. And it works very well. All my demos are with that system, with a similar one. So it works very, very good here. So the Azure Stack Development Kit is for functional tests. Very important point. So that means if you decide to go for a new application, if you have a developer in your mind which is calling you and said, hey, I would like to discuss the new options of container technologies, ASDK would be the good fit in this term. So use this for starting to development of your own use cases. And we heard a few things about. So that means also imagination with your other colleagues. What kind of use cases make sense for your department, for your company? The next thing is, always I heard, hey, ASDK is nice, but honestly, it's one server. We are just starting with 4, maybe 8, maybe 10s, 20s of servers. We need an appliance, always. We need the final thing from your OEM, and unless we didn't get it, we don't start in POC. Maybe if you find an OEM that will be put an appliance for free in your data center, it maybe works, but usually it's not. So for that, the ASDK looks completely the same as an appliance. So it has the same portals, the same scenarios on it. It looks the same as an appliance. We have on YouTube is a very good video from Charles Joy. Also, he did a session during the week about Azure Stack Development Kit and the single node system and why it matters. Take a deeper look on that. It's very, very helpful. So what it's not suitable for? Always a good question. It's not suitable for scale tests. That means you can't add another host to the system. It is still a single system. You can't extend it. It's a single node system. And it will be always a single node system, B. So the next one, HA. You can't add 1, 2, 3 more hosts and move an application from one host to another host. It's not possible. So it's always a single host system. And finally, performance tests. Okay, you can try, but it's in this case not the same as an appliance. So I will quickly show you the difference, and I always show my customers about what is the quickest way to understand the difference between an Azure Stack in a single node and an Azure Stack as an appliance. So maybe you saw it before. Here's a administration website from Azure Stack. So that is my single node system. And if you want to be sure that it's a single node or a multi-node, because it looks, honestly, it's the same, you need to go to the region and reach out the scale units where the entire server are in. Hopefully it works. Sometimes I need to refresh the website because I tried it a few times, so that is the point here, and he lost the credentials. So back again. And maybe it is also a point, this system, it stands in Munich, Germany. So today it's Oktoberfest there. So maybe that has also some implications. Okay, coming back to Azure Stack. And now you see a little bit faster. So we're clicking on the regions, scale units here. And you see, and we have a cluster. So that is the simplest thing that you have it on an appliance. But the only thing is, and we did a lot of sessions to get together with the hardware partners and hardware vendors, is we showed that page to the customer. And that is the only place, hopefully they find the one server where is running on. Okay, here's it. So one server. And you have the impression, how many do you see in your environment? 4. Thank you. So, but that is the only difference. So you can create your applications, you can create your processes on top of Azure Stack, and so on and so on. Very good. Oh, too loud. Back to the slides. So technical requirements for the ASDK. It's always a question. I mentioned about your own hardware. So I took a screenshot from the official website, and we mentioned a few things about gigabytes, about RAMs, about hard disks, and so on and so on. First of all, go to your hardware vendor and ask them for a pre-configured system. Usually they have one. So they offer pre-configured systems with all the services, with integration services, with already up and running ASDK on their hardware. Additional, I always recommend at minimum 256 gigabytes of RAM. Yes, I know. If you read the other slide, the other side from the website, here it's recommended 128 gigabytes of RAM. I know that. But if you want to add more services, if you want to add services from the marketplace or download your own images, if you want to start more than 1, 2, 3 VMs, or if you want to provide it to your internal customers or to your developers, then you need at least 256 gigabytes of RAM. And the next important point is, if I go to a customer and ask them, hey, we want to do a POC and we should ask the hardware vendor, sometimes they say, no, we sorted out yesterday an old machine that is 3-year-old. We can put some memory on that. Please don't do that. It usually not works very good and very fast for an ASDK. So use always more or less new hardware for that, and also with fast HDDs or better SSDs, so very, very fast flash drives. The next thing is about, if I'm talking about storage, no SAN. So even in the appliance, nor in the ASDK, you have the option to add a SAN for the fabric. So it's a new way, new deployment methods based on a hyper-converged system for Azure Stack here. So now we talked about the server, but as I mentioned, the more important thing here is the networking. And I can't repeat it so much time, that talk to your network guys, discuss the scenarios. So, and I always recommend, even we have a different option, the connected scenarios for the POC. Maybe if you decide after the POC to go for a disconnected scenario, that is okay, that is fine. But I always recommend to start with a connected scenario. So that means at the end of the day, we have two options, a connected scenario to internet, to Azure, from Azure Stack, from ASDK, but also we have the option for a disconnected scenario, so you don't need to have an internet connectivity. I will talk about it a little bit later. Let's start with a connected scenario. So, and you see here direct internet access. That is the best option. So, what does this mean? You have one hardware, and in that hardware is one physical network card. Usually there is more. Can you buy a physical server today with one network NIC or one network port? I don't think so. At least two? Yeah, I think so. So that means disables the second one. First thing. So you have one network card in this server and that get one IP address. If you deploy the Azure Stack, there will spin up a few VMs, I think about 20 VMs. And one of the VMs are the BGP NAT VM. And the BGP NAT VM has also a network card and an IP address. So at the end of the day, you need two IP addresses that needs to be access the internet. Internet and Azure. So the easiest way in this case is a direct internet access. So I like my home because I have a small private router, NAT gateway, whatever, and I connect them, plug it in, and it works. So that is always the easiest way. But the most of you working in companies that have more requirements on security, maybe, or more regulations on internet access. And here comes in a proxy. In which companies are you don't use a proxy and you are not able to use a proxy? How many from here? Okay, no. Oh, one. So that means everyone needs a proxy. But I wouldn't say bad thing. The complicated thing here is that Azure Stack doesn't support any proxy configurations. So you can't put a proxy in even without authentication. You can't put it here. And that brings me to a term that I learned with Azure Stack a lot. Honestly, it's a transparent proxy. So a transparent proxy, it always sits between a system that needs connectivity to the internet and the internet. So that means this transparent proxy forwarded the packages directly to the next device or directly to the internet. So I will put the transparent proxy here in. In that case, always the transparent proxy comes automatically as a default gateway. So because the system, the Azure Stack itself, doesn't know about any proxy. So how should they go directly to the internet? He took the default route, and the default route is through the default gateway, and that hits the transparent proxy, and that reaches out the next firewall, NAT gateway, and goes to the internet. That works sometimes. But the most of my customers has the requirement of their own proxy, have the requirement to use their own proxy, the corporate proxy. So and then we come to another new term that I learned with Azure Stack a lot, is the term of a proxy chain. So in this, that means you have here, your company has their own proxy, has a corporate proxy, and the transparent proxy forwarded the request to a corporate proxy with authentication, with everything you need, and the corporate proxy reached out the internet as you all know for the default way. So that is maybe a possible way to do that, to connect an Azure Stack with the internet. But honestly, I will go back. If you have a good connection to your network department, try that out first. That is the easiest one. So, I talked about the connected scenario. Let me come to the disconnected scenario. So that means, what are the difference between connected and disconnected scenarios here? The Azure Stack has the ability to connect, or the Azure Stack services itself, to connect to Azure, in some cases to sovereignties clouds like Azure Government, Azure China, and also we have the disconnected way. So we have here one line. The first line is license and billing. So that means if you decide, even in or more appropriate in an appliance, if you decide to use a consumption-based model, so the pay-as-you-go model with Azure Stack, you have the only choice to go to the Azure Worldwide. It is not possible to get the commerce engine to connect them with Azure Germany or Azure China or Azure US Government today. We are working on that, but not today. If you are in a disconnected scenario, so you don't have the ability to connect your Azure Stack to the internet or even to Azure, or if you have not, or if you don't want to do that for any reasons, then the capacity model comes in from the license perspective. So that means you have another choice for the disconnected scenarios. The next one is the identity. I mentioned that before about the Azure. You should understood Azure AD, ADFS, and so on and so on. So you can connect, or you can use for the identity in Azure Stack and Azure ID, in Azure Worldwide, and Azure Germany, or Azure China, or US Government. So in sovereignties clouds. That is already possible. That brings me to an, okay. And if you are not be able, or if you're not allowed to connect Azure Stack to the internet or to Azure, you can go with ADFS. For these two lines, is a special one. These are independent from each other. So that means if you go for an ADFS model, so you use if you use your local Active Directory for the identity or for the authentication to your Azure Stack, then you can do the consumption model. Or if you use the Azure AD for the authenticated of your customers on the Azure Stack, then you can do the capacity model. So you have the choice from both lines for independence from each other. There are more lines coming. We have the marketplace syndication. I think the most of you seen this in several sessions to understand you can download marketplace items from Azure to Azure Stack and provide it to your customers. So if you're in a connected scenario, so if you have the ability to connect your Azure Stack to Azure, then you can only use Azure Worldwide for now. If you're in a disconnected scenarios, there's a good documentation out there, but you have only the ability to use your own custom images. So you can upload your custom images, your company, corporate, high secured image to Azure Stack and add them with several extensions or scripts or whatever you need. But it's important here that you can do that or even in a disconnected way, but also in a connected way. So if you have a connected scenario, then you can go for a marketplace syndication, but also you have the ability to upload your own custom images. But in a disconnected scenario, only custom images works for now. And the next line is about disaster recovery. That means disaster recovery with Azure Site Recovery only works from Azure Stack to Azure and only works for Azure worldwide. No sovereignty clouds, and of course, no, not in a disconnected way, because if it's disconnected, you can't reach out Azure. Okay. We are working on that if we have multiple regions available. And maybe you heard it that we are working on that. Then it will be possible to have an Azure Site Recovery service between two Azure Stack sites or Azure Stack regions. That is a very important point. So I talked about what are the requirements from the organization standpoint, from the technical standpoint, what are Azure Stack policies are on Azure, and what an ASDK means, and how I can connect them to Azure, and I connect them to some hybrid services and in a network scenario. And that brings me to Carsten, and you will talk about what is your impression on the perfect world of Azure Stack, right?
Thank you, Alexander. So I'm Carsten from Germany. I am the owner of a system integrator in Germany, and we do a lot of, I go to the next slide. The company is called Rachfal IT Solutions, and we do a lot of work in the virtualization area. So I'm an infrastructure as a service guy on premises, and I have a lot of customers who are at the virtualization stage. They are not in the cloud yet. And I will talk about my journey to Azure Stack first. So I think a lot of you guys were as amazed as I was in May 2015 when Microsoft announced Azure Stack at Ignite in Chicago. It was in May 2015. We were doing at that time a lot of Windows Azure Pack projects at customers. Windows Azure Pack is System Center, Hyper-V, normal storage, and you can still do that today. But when I saw Azure Stack presented by Microsoft at Ignite, I was completely amazed. And I saw a lot of opportunities for my customer to get their virtualization add Azure Stack to that and have new services on premises. And then I would call it the dreaming phase. After Ignite, I and a lot of customers were thinking about what they can do with Azure Stack, adding Azure Stack to their local environments. Then I had the opportunity in October 2016 to do with two German customers to come to Redmond to do a hybrid cloud EBC with those guys, and it was fascinating. These were huge German customers, and they have, of course, data centers. They have multiple data centers. They use synchronous replication. They have their way how they do IT, and they had also their imaginations what they could do with Azure Stack. And I realized at these 3 days what Microsoft really means, or what it really means. Azure Stack is Azure in your data center. So this was a little bit of a disappointment for me, because I was dreaming about adding Azure services to the IT model that I was doing then at customers. And also for these customers was a huge rethinking of how they would add Azure Stack to their environments, and if it's even possible. So if you are doing virtualization with Hyper-V, with SAN storage, with System Center, Azure Stack does not fit into that and will not bring Azure services to your IT how you do it now. So after that, we did a lot of testing with Azure Stack and did some POCs, and I got used to the possibilities to get Azure services in our customers' data center. So we help customers to implement Azure Stack, and I'm very excited today that at Ignite we can now get the solutions. We can get integrated systems. We are talking about the different vendors who deliver now integrated systems to customers. But I can't stress more than Alexander did it before, start with an Azure Stack development kit. Really look at the stuff, try it out if it fits your needs. Because a lot of customers think about what they can do with Azure Stack, but Azure Stack does not really do that, what they want. So try it out, play with it before you go to a vendor and order an integrated system. So, and I'm really excited about the future because I see a huge potential for customers, for my company to help customers to embrace Azure Stack and the hybrid cloud model. Alexander and Krista told you there should be a business case. So if you want to do infrastructure as a service, like you can do it now perfectly with Hyper-V, failover clustering, storage spaces direct System Center, I think Azure Stack is maybe not the right choice for you. You have a perfect model now. It's working very well. You have to find a business case. What do you want to achieve with Azure Stack? What do you want to achieve with Azure? And I have three business cases here. For example, hybrid cloud. You can leverage Azure Stack to build a hybrid cloud and use infrastructure as a service, services, and PaaS services in Azure and also in your Azure Stack. Yeah? You maybe have the need to have the stuff local because of latency. There are latency and a lot of other reasons why you can't do public cloud. Maybe you're not, like we are in Germany, we have now our own cloud, but maybe you are in an area where Microsoft hasn't yet built data centers and you have latency to the cloud or other reasons. Your data sovereignty, right? Yeah, forget it. There are a lot of reasons why you maybe don't want to embrace the public cloud. Then Azure Stack is something for you. For service providers, providing Azure services in their data centers is, I think, a very nice offering, and they can enrich Azure services with their own solutions. And I learned on Ignite that there is even a German company, Wortmann, who will also bring their own Azure Stack that you can buy, and you can also put services in their data centers placed on Azure Stack. So I think Azure Stack for service providers is also a very nice choice. And don't forget the developers. So if you want to get your developers to program with the new cloud model, with the new services, maybe it's very interesting to have an Azure Stack on site. For example, if you are in a vertical where you can't go out with your data. I have two examples here. Healthcare, for example, having very sensitive customer information, maybe images, if you do X-rays or so on, or such things, or tax industry. If you are doing in Germany, we are very curious about taxes, and it's a big secret. So you don't want those information maybe in the public cloud, but you can still build up your services and have it running in Azure Stack on your premises. So I think there are some really nice possibilities there. I learned, well, first let's talk about my favorite feature in Azure Stack, and you mentioned it already. What I really love is the Azure Marketplace syndication. And a quick question, who of you have tried the Azure Marketplace syndication? 1, 2, 3, okay, 4, of course you have. So what is it? You have, I always call it solutions. You have Azure Marketplace items in the public cloud, and with the Azure Marketplace syndication, if the ISV who is developing this, marketplace solution or marketplace item says, I want it also be available in Azure Stack, you can in essence go, I will restart the animation, you can in essence click in the Azure Stack Marketplace to add from Azure. You can browse a lot of solutions. You click on the solutions. Here I'm doing it with Microsoft Anti-Malware. There's of course some things you have to agree to, the license model, and then you click download, and depending on how large your solution is, maybe you download a SQL Server and it has 127 gigabytes. It takes a while, but when it's downloaded, you can immediately use the solution for your tenants. And that's a very nice thing. You don't have to download your ISOs, your ARM templates, and build the solution yourself. You can use Azure solutions for that, and I love this feature. So, of course, I also see a lot of challenges at customers. First, they have to understand the cloud model. Azure Stack is not virtualization. I can't stress it enough, if you want to do virtualization, talk to the virtualization guys, there are nice solutions there from Microsoft. I do a lot of Hyper-V failover clustering with customers, but Azure Stack is not infrastructure as a service. There is a better way for that. You have to identify a use case, the right use case. Why do you want to do Azure Stack? It's nice, it's fancy, you get Azure in your data center, but that should not be the only reason to adopt Azure Stack. Alexander and Krista said it already, you have to understand Azure. You should start with Azure, see what's possible in Azure, if that fits your needs. If this is something you want, with Azure Stack you get the same. Not all is possible that you can do in Azure, but a lot. And if you are comfortable with Azure, with the cloud model, you can use Azure Stack. And a huge challenge is today when I'm at a service provider or an enterprise customer, they usually have silos. So they have a network department, they have a storage department, they have a compute department. And Azure Stack, there is everything of those things in Azure Stack. So networking, there is software-defined networking used in Azure Stack, but it's not going out of Azure Stack. The exit points are IPv3, so you don't need that. You only need your network guys on the edge. They have to provide the access to Azure Stack, but they are not responsible for the networking in Azure Stack. The same with the storage guys. The system is based on a hyperconverged storage spaces direct solutions. You will never see it. All the VMs are stored in Azure Stack. So your SAN people are not needed with Azure Stack. And you have to talk to these organizations if they are comfortable with that. Yeah? So there is maybe a lot of people who don't agree to go to the new software-defined model, and you have to talk to them. Okay, we can do a demo now, or we can do a Q&A.
I think a Q&A would be good.
What do you think about a Q&A? Are there questions in the audience? There are. If you would come to the microphone, that would be perfect.
I have a question for Christer. You mentioned about the hardware vendors. Some were shipping and some were taking orders.
Yeah.
Can you please repeat which one does what and when?
So we have 4 vendors that are taking orders right now. It's Dell EMC, it's HP, it's Lenovo, and also Cisco. The ones that are delivering now are the first 3, so Dell, EMC, HP, and Lenovo. And then we have Huawei and Wortmann coming up later on. So, any other questions? Yep.
Could you see Azure Stack as an enabler for creating a private cloud rather than the use cases that you mentioned, or hybrid, or a completely private cloud?
We support the disconnected scenario, so in that sense, yes. But again, it's not about virtualization, and it's not about those traditional things.
Exactly.
But
Services,
we're talking a lot to, for example, highly regulated customers that are not allowed to go out, defense customers, and so on. So definitely.
Exactly. Like in place of, let's say, an OpenStack / Cloud Foundry type of.
But the intention of Azure Stack is really to provide Azure services. So there should be a need of Azure services in there, and ideally modern applications.
So in this extension of that, since you see Azure Stack as an extension of Azure, is there an option to build or extend Azure Stack as a fault-tolerant type of private cloud where you have availability zones globally across different regions?
Yeah, the use cases I showed you earlier on, they're based on what we can do today. So we have a roadmap, and we will add, for example, support of multiple regions sometime next year. So we will add to those capabilities, definitely.
Thank you.
Okay, anything else? If not, I would like to thank you, Carsten, and also everyone for taking the time to join us. So thank you.